The first topic that we're going to cover is we are going to focus on just kind of summarizing what the overall structure of the public forum activity is. Some of this is going to be a review for some of you, especially those who have gotten a chance to work with us already. You will be familiar with the general outline of this, but my goal is we're going to get everyone on the same page regarding what kind of the components of a public forum debate are, what the goals of a public forum round are, what the general philosophy behind it is. And hopefully even those of you who have gotten a chance to work with us already, we will get you a little bit caught up to speed on some of the modifications that we are making to the American public forum debate style to adjust it to the English debate format to hopefully, as Charlotte was describing, lower the barrier to entry and make it a little bit easier for people to participate. And yes, for those of you who did not see the chat just then, this is something I want to underscore for the whole seminar is if at any point in the seminar, anybody has a question, if one of us is talking, the other one of us will be monitoring the chat. So if people want to ask a question, messaging the chat is a great way to do that. I believe there is also a raise hand function that you can use, and that will show us that you all have a question, and it will give us a second to pause, and we will pause and address any confusion that you have. So do not be shy, do not hesitate. Some of the information we'll be covering is definitely somewhat confusing. So if somebody wants more clarification about something, definitely don't be shy and feel absolutely free to ask. So with that, what is public forum debate? Public forum debate, which we also call PF debate or PFD for short, is a style of debate in which the goal is to discuss the pros and cons of an assigned topic. It is similar to the non-policy style in terms of the broad subject that we are discussing. But the main difference between them is in the structure of the round and in the number of teams that are debating for each side. So in the non-policy style we've done so far, there's been 2 speeches and a lot of cross-examination and 2 teams on each side. So 2 teams on the affirmative side and 2 teams on the negative side. Here, the speech structure is a little bit different. And there's 1 team representing the pro side, which is the public forum name for the affirmative, or the con, and 1 team representing the con side, which is the public forum name for the negative. Much like with non-policy debate, each school has to be prepared to debate both sides. So that doesn't necessarily mean every team or every group of students will debate both sides, but each school needs to prepare both sides of the resolution or the topic. A unique feature of public forum debate, which I want to introduce kind of right at the outset, is this idea of the burdens that each side has to meet. And when I say burdens, what I mean is there is kind of a job for each side. There is a job for the pro team and there is a job for the con team. And these jobs are what each team kind of has to satisfy in order to have successfully made an argument and in order to have successfully performed their role in the debate. These burdens are called proof and rejoinder. Proof and rejoinder. Another way to think of it is proof and disproof. Disproof and rejoinder mean the same thing. The burdens of proof and rejoinder are kind of the foundation of what each side has to do. The burden of proof means that when a side introduces an argument, they have the burden to present some proof that that argument is true, right? The burden of proof is very familiar, and that is something that is kind of a feature of almost every debate event. You can't just state an argument without a reason and expect it to carry any amount of weight, right? The burden of proof means you have to provide some demonstration of why your argument is true. Now, the unique feature of public forum is the second piece. So the burden of disproof or the burden of rejoinder. The burden of disproof means that once your opponent has introduced an argument, it is your burden to provide a disproof or a response or a rejoinder to that argument. If you do not do this, then that argument is then treated as if it is true for the rest of the debate. So basically, if your opponent brings something up, you have to answer it. If you do not, then your opponent's argument is treated as true for the rest of the debate because you have failed your burden of disproof or your burden of rejoinder. Now, the reason I'm putting so much focus on this is because these two burdens set the structure for the rest of the activities. They set the structure for the speeches, and they provide our basic idea for what the teams need to be achieving. In each speech that I will be going through, everything that the teams are doing is shaped by these two burdens. You are advancing your own argument and providing proof for the things you're saying, and you are systematically going through and responding to the arguments that your opponent makes. So before I move into the actual speech structure, are there any questions about these basic ideas so far?
Anthony, I just have a very quick question about the burden of rejoinder. You said that we have to respond to our opponent's arguments, otherwise those arguments will be considered as true. When do we have to respond to those arguments? For example, in the case speech, the pro says something. Does that mean that the con side have to respond to the arguments in their case speech as well? Can they, no, I'm sorry, in the rebuttal speeches, can they respond to it later?
That's a great point. So I will go into more detail about the exact speeches when responses need to happen. But the general rule is that with one exception, the opponent must respond to an argument in their next speech, so at their next available opportunity. So in the specific example that you are bringing up, the answer is yes. So if there is a component of what we call your case or your argument that you have brought up in your constructive speech, which is the first speech, and the other team's rebuttal does not address that argument, then that argument is treated as true. So now that does not mean that there's nothing new that can be said about that argument later on, right? We can make new comparisons, we can provide new reasons for our responses, or we can go into more depth about our existing arguments for why kind of the other side has said something wrong. But generally speaking, our main responses to the other side's arguments need to be introduced in the next available speech that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before we move on to the sequence of speeches or the order of speeches? And for those of you who just got here, please change your name in the Zoom to include your English name and your Chinese name for attendance purposes. Okay. So before I go into the exact order of speeches, I want to say a couple of words about public forum debate topics. I'm not going to talk about these too long because they're fairly similar to the kinds of topics that we have debated in the past. The one difference is how often the topics rotate. So in the US, in US style public forum, the topic actually changes once every 1 or 2 months. But for the purposes of our activity here, we will be using a different topic for every semester. So there will be fall events that use one topic, and there will be spring events that use a different topic. And the topics that are chosen are usually going to focus on something current or in the news. And these topics can pertain to policy changes, or they can pertain to philosophical ideas. Just because the topic can pertain to policy, that does not mean this is like policy debate. The goal is not to discuss the super small details of how these topics will be implemented. So for example, in last year's tournament, the topic focused on whether the use of the English test as a graduation requirement should be discontinued in universities in Taiwan. And that is a topic that pertains to policy because it connects to policies that the government has enacted, but the discussion did not focus on changing those policies. It just focused on whether the test was good or bad and whether the test should or should not be discontinued. Similarly, in public forum, the focus is not on the policy details so much as it is on the general pros and cons of the resolution. On this year's or this semester's for this next semester, for the fall semester, as well as for the rest of this camp, the resolution that we'll be using is this. It is resolved. In Taiwan, social media is beneficial for democratic values. In Taiwan, social media is beneficial for democratic values. We will come back to this resolution and we will talk about it in much more detail over these next couple of days, but I just wanted to make a note that that is what we are going to focus on for the first semester. So this is the general structure of a public forum debate. The big idea is that the two teams, the pro team and the con team, will take turns giving speeches using their logic, their evidence, and various comparisons to prove that their arguments are true and their opponent's arguments are false, and to prove their side of the resolution. So the general outline, so there are 4 different speeches. So in non-policy debate, there were 2 speeches. In public forum debate, there are 4 speeches that are given by each team. In between the speeches, there is a period called the crossfire. In United States public forum debate, there are restrictions on who can talk during which of these time periods. And as Charlotte mentioned in the introduction, we have actually modified that requirement, so that is not going to be a requirement. We are encouraging teamwork, so the whole team can participate during each of these speeches. So this is the broad outline of what happens in a public forum debate. The first speech that happens in a public forum debate is called the constructive speech. The constructive speech is 4 minutes long, and it is similar to the introduction or the case speech in English non-policy debate. What happens in this speech is that teams introduce their case arguments. So the pro side of our resolution will give their basic introduction of their arguments for why social media is beneficial for democratic values in Taiwan. And the con team will give a speech about why social media is not beneficial for democratic values in Taiwan. Now, this is where, in response to Charlotte, you were asking earlier, you were asking, does the other team have to reply in the next speech? Do they have some time to respond? And I said that there was one exception, and this is that one exception. So the pro constructive will happen first, and the pro team will introduce their case. The con team does not have to immediately respond to the pro's case, right? So in these constructive speeches, we're not really debating against each other yet. All that is happening is each team gets 4 minutes to present their initial arguments. They do not have to disprove everything that the other side said yet. That happens in later speeches. And because of that, constructive speeches, much like the introduction or case speeches that you have debated in the past, should be written in advance completely. So some of these later speeches, you are going to have to think on your feet a little bit and adjust to what is happening in the debate. For these speeches, you should prepare them in advance. After the constructive speech, we have a crossfire. The crossfire is 3 minutes long, and the crossfire is similar to a cross-examination. It is the period of time in the debate when teams get to ask each other questions, and the opponent has to provide some responses to those questions. The difference between a crossfire and a cross-examination, though, is that the crossfire happens after both teams have given their speeches and both teams actually participate in both asking and answering questions. So the analogy I like to use for this is it's a little bit like ping pong or table tennis. So one team sends the other team the ball by asking them a question. The other team answers the question and then asks their own question, sending the ball right back. And the teams kind of take turns sending the ball back and forth, asking and answering each other's questions until the 3 minutes is up. The one thing that I will note about this speech, in addition to everything else, is that this is the main part of the debate where teams usually request to see any evidence that was cited by their opponents. So if a team cited a particular source in their constructive, and in the crossfire, the other team requests to see that source, so to see the quote that is being used or the piece of data that is being used to support the argument, crossfire is kind of when that evidence would need to be shared with the other team. After the crossfire, we have the rebuttal. So we've had a constructive where each side has introduced their arguments. Rebuttal is where this rejoinder element kicks in. So rebuttal is also 4 minutes long, and the purpose of the rebuttal is that each team starts to introduce their responses to the other side. So the first speech, you presented 4 minutes of your own arguments, and in the rebuttal, you get 4 minutes just to respond to the other side's arguments. So again, this is another exception. So the pro rebuttal goes first. So the pro will spend 4 minutes explaining why the con's case is incorrect. The con rebuttal, even though it goes after the pro rebuttal, does not need to respond to the pro rebuttal quite yet. Just like the constructive is 4 dedicated minutes where you just get to explain your argument, the rebuttal is 4 dedicated minutes where you just get to explain everything that is wrong with what your opponent said in their constructive. And once the rebuttal is over, there is another crossfire. All of the crossfires are the same, so I'm not going to re-explain how the crossfires work. Just note that there is a crossfire after the constructives, there's one after the rebuttal, and there's one more in the debate. Any questions about what I've talked about so far?
Okay, again, I have a question. Anthony, you just said that for example, if the pro goes first, and you said for the con rebuttal, it's the speaker is primarily rebutting the arguments in the pro's constructive speech, but not in the pro's rebuttal speech.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so the beginning of the debate is very simple. So it's just in your constructive speech, you explain your arguments. In the rebuttal speech, you explain what's wrong with your opponent's arguments. That's it.
Okay.
The later speeches is where kind of the real back and forth starts happening.
Okay.
And I have a question here also.
Yep.
What's the difference between crossfire and rebuttal, except for both pros and cons can participate in rebuttal? Crossfire.
Yeah, good question. So the constructive speech and the rebuttal speech are both speeches where it's just one team talking the whole time. So in the pro constructive, right, it's just the pro team members laying out their case. In the pro rebuttal, it's just the pro team members laying out what they think is wrong with the cons case, right? The crossfire is different because there is an answer period and not just a question period. So the pro team would ask the con team a question, then right there in those 3 minutes, the con answers the question and then asks a question of their own, right? So the constructive and rebuttal, only one team is talking at a time. In the crossfire, it's kind of a conversation. So it's not so much a speech as it is a back and forth where one side asks the other side something and gets a response, then the other side gets to ask the first side and get a response, and so on and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Great questions. Anything else I can clear up before we move on? All right.
I'm sorry, I have one question.
Yep.
Yeah, just as you mentioned earlier that we have to respond what the previous speaker had said, and here you use in the third point you say the second rebuttal doesn't need to respond to the first. Will that be a little bit of different?
Yeah, so like I mentioned at the beginning, there's an exception. So the general idea is once your opponent says something, you have to answer it.
Yeah.
But the one exception to that is kind of this beginning part of the debate where the constructives don't need to respond to one another and the rebuttals also don't need to respond to one another. So the rebuttal has to answer the constructive. That's all the rebuttal has to do. Once the rebuttals are over, and I'll get into this in the next couple of speeches, then the broader rule that I was describing takes over and teams have to respond to everything that their opponents said in their last speech. Any other questions at this point?
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question. So is this a part where you disprove your opponent's is it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, sorry. Yes. So the first speech is where each side introduces their arguments, and then in the rebuttals, that's when you answer what your opponent said in their constructive.
I mean, in your previous speech, you have mentioned the proof and disproof burden, and is this part where you disprove?
Yeah. So this is the first speech where you start doing disproof or rejoinder. The only exception is you just don't have to. The second rebuttal doesn't need to talk about the first yet. That's the only exception. But yes, that's exactly right. This is if the constructive brings up an argument for why, let's say the pro constructive brings up a big argument about why social media makes people more informed and that is beneficial for democracy. If the con rebuttal does not address this argument, then they're in trouble. So the con needs to address the pro's constructive and the pro needs to address the con's constructive. That's all that's happening in the rebuttals. All right. Yep, Shanna's thing in the chat is exactly right. Your constructive is why you are correct, and your rebuttal is why your opponent is wrong. I think people are getting hung up on this burden of proof and rejoinder thing, but I think it will get cleared up as we go through the next couple of speeches, what I was referring to. For the beginning part of the debate, the simplest way to think about it is just to think about your constructive is explaining why you are right, and the rebuttal is responding to the other side's constructive. And that's all there is to it at this point.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that in the crossfire session, each side can ask each other question, right?
Yes.
So I'm wondering if it will be a mess if like each other is asking questions too, because each other have different stances.
Yeah, that's a good question. So crossfire is a little bit tricky, and if the debaters are being rude or yelling over each other, it is definitely very easy for crossfire to turn into a little bit of a mess. And for that reason, a really important part of being good at crossfire, which we will go into, we have a whole session that is going to be devoted to crossfire. We actually have a brilliant guest lecturer coming in who's going to talk all about crossfire. And that will hopefully clear it up. But the broad answer to your question is just, it's very important for the debaters to be polite and to not interrupt one another and not yell over each other for this to work.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. So we've gone through the first two speeches and the first two crossfires. The next thing that happens is our summary speech. So we had a constructive speech, a rebuttal speech, and now we have a summary speech. The summary speech is 3 minutes, and starting with the summary speech, the teams kind of have to answer everything that their opponent said, and if they didn't answer something that their opponent said, it becomes true. So let's say you're the pro team, the constructives have happened, the rebuttals have happened, so you've introduced your arguments, the con side has made their attacks against your arguments. Now, in your summary speech, your job is to defend your arguments against your opponent's attacks and to push forward with your attacks on what your opponent said. So the key thing to know about this speech, and the most important skill that is required to be good at this speech, is being strategic and making choices. So remember, the earlier speeches are 4 minutes long. The summary speech is a little bit shorter. It's just 3 minutes long. And the reason that matters is that you actually have less time to respond and to go through all of these different arguments than your opponents had to make their arguments. So you might not be able to cover everything, and you might not be able to push forward with all of the different answers you had to your opponent's case. So the summary speech is all about making choices. So you will push forward with your arguments that you think are the most important. And if you think your opponent has a great answer to a piece of your case and you can't really defend against it, you could concede that argument and decide that you're not going to go for that part of your case. So you're focusing on the best parts of your argument, and you are using your best attacks against your opponent's argument. There is a crossfire after this speech as well. So crossfire, or sorry, constructive speech, you introduce your argument. Your rebuttal speech, you introduce your responses to your opponent. And in the summary speech, you're kind of pushing both of those things forward. You're defending your case and you're continuing to attack your opponent's case. Questions about that? Okay. Oh, do I see a question? I think someone unmuted.
好，出现这个。诶，刚刚现在出现我自己的声音。
Sorry, I can't really hear. Do you have?
有出现会议的声音。
Wait, Violet, do you have a question? I think you're unmuted, but I can't really hear. The sound is a little bit choppy.
可以关上来。我
Okay, I think that's a technical glitch. Yeah, I couldn't. If you were asking a question, I couldn't really hear. So maybe if you could ask the chat, it would be easier. Okay. The last speech in the debate is called the final focus, and the final focus basically works the same as the summary, which is you're pushing forward your arguments, you're pushing forward your best attacks against your opponent. The one thing that's different is, of course, the speech is even shorter. It's 2 minutes long instead of 3 like the summary. So choices are even more important. Like the name suggests, the point of the final focus is just to focus in on your best materials, the best reasons you should win, the best responses to what your opponent said. This is your final closing pitch for why you should get to win the debate. And there is no crossfire after this because this is the last speech in the debate. Any questions about the final focus or the summary? Or anything else before we move on?
Is it true that any arguments you mentioned in the final focus speech have to be the arguments that you already mentioned in the summary speech?
Yes, yes, that is a good point. So the summary speech and the final focus speech are designed to focus on and develop the arguments you already made in your constructive and your rebuttal. So you can add justifications for your arguments, you can make comparisons between your arguments and your opponent's arguments, but completely new arguments are off limits. You cannot make entirely new arguments that have never been made before in the final focus or in the summary. And the reason for this is very simple. If the team could make new arguments in the final focus, then the team that speaks last would always win because the other side doesn't have a chance to respond to them. So yes, that is exactly right. Other questions? Okay. Prep time. So prep time made an appearance on the diagram, but I haven't talked about it yet. The prep time is the time that debaters get in the middle of the debate to prepare their speeches. There is a limited amount of prep time for each team. And generally speaking, the way that this will work, I think the exact way it will work will depend on the tournament. The way it will work at the NTNU tournaments is there will be pre-assigned prep times. So there will be points in the debate where the debate pauses and debaters get to think about the debate, prepare the speeches that are going to happen next, think about what their opponents have said and try to come up with some responses. At some other events, there may be a different system where prep time is flexible. So the way that would work is each team would get 4 minutes of prep time, and at any time they can call prep and start taking prep, and they can choose to spend their prep time whenever they want during the debate. But the way it will work during the NTNU debates is just like it worked for the English non-policy debates, and that will be that there are times in the debate when the debate pauses and everybody gets some time to think before their next set of speeches. The last difference that I want to mention, and we'll get into this in more detail later. I'm not going to go too in depth about this, but there's a concept in public forum debates that has not really come up in non-policy debates and English non-policy debates, and that is the idea of framework. Framework is very simple. It is how the judge should decide the debate. And framework can be any number of things. It could be very broad. It could be that the judge should vote for the side that creates the most happiness or saves the most lives or takes the most moral position. But on this topic, which is that social media is beneficial for democratic values in Taiwan, the topic tells us that the teams need to focus on which side creates the best democratic values. So teams can make framework arguments that tell the judge what the most important democratic values are, and then the teams will have a debate about that and compare what the most important democratic values are to each other. So one team might say the most important value is informed voting. Another team might say the most important value is civil rights. And that is an idea that is pretty unique to public forum. It is a set of instructions for how the judge should determine the winner of the debate. We'll go into this in more detail later throughout the seminar. So just to wrap up, I want to spell out these core differences from English non-policy debate. I've already mentioned these, but this is just to kind of summarize it all for those of you who are transitioning from one to the other. The differences are one team per side instead of two. There are more speeches and crossfires. We are taking turns asking and answering questions in crossfire instead of just one team asking questions like in cross-examination. And there are the burdens of proof and rejoinder. So the burden of proof is the same, but there's this added burden of rejoinder, which is that you have a burden to respond to what the other side said throughout the debate. Otherwise, it is kind of presumed to be true. All right. That concludes our general introduction to public forum debate. Before we move on, does anyone have questions about anything that I just talked
How many times can we call prep?
So again, that depends. In the NTNU modified public forum style, the prep time happens at specific points in the debate. I believe it's after every set of speeches, if I remember correctly, and before the crossfires, but don't quote me on that. That is something that is spelled out in the rule set on the website that was sent to the chat earlier, I believe. Charlotte can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But in the other style where you can choose when to spend your prep time, teams can spend their prep time however they want. They can call prep time at any point, and they can call it however many times they want to until they run out of their total. So you would have like 4 minutes to spend for the whole debate, and you can spend all 4 minutes early. You could save your prep time and use it all late, or you could use a little bit after every speech. It's up to you. But during the NTNU debates, that decision will be made for you, and there are specific times when teams are prepping for the next speech.
Yeah, in our tournament is before and after the crossfire. There is a prep time.
Yeah, thanks. Oh yeah, Shanna makes a good point, which is you cannot call prep time in the middle of a speech. So once you start talking, the timer is running and you have to finish talking. And that's true under both the NTNU style and any other style of public forum debate. You can never call prep time in the middle of a speech. You can only call it in between speeches and in between crossfires. Any other questions?
Can we use new evidence or resource in a final focus to support our speech in a final focus?
Not in the final focus, I would say. With the summary, it's a little bit blurrier because sometimes you might need a new piece of evidence to respond to something your opponent said in their rebuttal. But usually you don't want to be using new evidence in the summary or in the final focus. In the final focus, really, you never want to be using new evidence. In the summary, occasionally you can, but as a rule, you shouldn't either. The new evidence should really be introduced early in the debate, in the constructive speeches and in the rebuttal speeches.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So is that the same as what Jenna just typed in the chat panel? Summary and final focus, only new examples, but no new arguments. So if it's new evidence, would that be considered, I mean, examples, would that be considered as new evidence as well?
But by new example, and Shanna, you can chime in and clarify if I summarize your point incorrectly here. But so we'll talk about exactly how evidence works, but the general idea is you might introduce a piece of evidence early in the debate. So maybe in your rebuttal, you present a piece of evidence from a study, and that study has a bunch of different examples in it, or a bunch of different, maybe it'll make a broad theoretical argument, and then it'll give some instances of that being true. So maybe one example is with the social media topic, we might talk about fake news on social media, and the con might bring up an example in their rebuttal of a time when fake news spread through social media and it was damaging, right? So just because the rebuttal only brought up one example of that happening, that doesn't mean that the summary or the final focus cannot bring up a different example of when social media was a source of fake news or misinformation, right? So it's a new example, but it's the same argument, which is that social media spreads misinformation and it makes it really easy for fake news to get out. Does that make sense? Or is that helpful?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that, because when it comes to evidence, it can be more than just examples. For example, it can be another study, which is not mentioned earlier. So if that's the case, can we bring up a different study in the summary or final focus speech?
So there we go. That's tricky. My default personally in the way that I view debate would be you cannot bring up another piece of evidence that is about a different study. If you want to bring up another piece of evidence that is about the same exact study that talks and provides more examples, that would be okay because it's in the same argument group. But a new study is a completely new argument because it is based on something you have not established yet. So, for example, to follow along with Anthony's fake news story example, which is a great example. So you could say, let's say you found research from Reuters, I don't know, that talks about how fake news is spread through social media. And you're like, oh, look, here's the thing. And that's what the con team says. And then the pro team's like, oh, they only have one example. That's all they give us. That's not enough to tell you that this is a real thing. The con could then in the summary say, okay, fine, you want more examples here, and then they could just start listing more examples of when fake news stories spread throughout social media very quickly and how that was damaging. But they couldn't come up with another piece of evidence from, let's say, the Associated Press that talks about a completely different study that says that fake news stories are happening all the time and they start talking about different types of statistics. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Let me say it's a weird fine line that is always walked in debate. And some judges are going to believe that something is a new argument, and some judges are going to believe that new evidence is not a new argument. And my rule of thumb, right, what I tell my students is that if you have to read new evidence in your summary speech, that's a bad sign for you. You should always be able to rely on warrants, which we'll talk about in Toolman's model, which is our next lecture, and be able to use what you've already read in all the evidence you've already read to be able to defend your position, right? If you're having to bring new evidence up, you miss something in your rebuttal speech. And by the time you get to the summary, it's too late to answer that. That argument. So you probably shouldn't waste your time reading it anyway.
Okay. And just and it's just a very quick related question. So does that rule also apply to policy debate, that you are not supposed to bring up new evidence in the rebuttal speeches?
Rebuttal speeches are, policy.
Policy.
Correct. Well, Anthony, you're better with policy.
With policy, at least with policy in the US, the restriction is a little bit looser. So it's generally considered slightly more acceptable to bring up new evidence in the first rebuttal, but in the second rebuttal, it's still pretty categorically off limits unless something super, super weird is going on.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And honestly, that's something that even, the most seasoned debaters and judges will differ on their interpretation of what counts as a new argument versus a new example sometimes.
The easy way to think about it is just at the beginning of the debate, you're introducing arguments, and then the end of the debate is designed to resolve the arguments that have been introduced. So the pro team has said one thing, the con team has said the opposite. Now we use what has been said to try to figure out which side is right about that thing. We're not really bringing up.
Rebuilding what you already said or reinforcing what you already said. You're not constructing a new building, is another way I will explain it sometimes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. What's the standard to decide which side is winning in the debate?
So we will have a whole session on judging, because the question you've asked is it's a challenging one. The answer, actually, I'll give you a brief preview of what we're going to say, which is if you have some experience with non-policy debate under the NTNU English style, it will actually be somewhat similar in the sense that you will still get a rubric with a set of categories and judging criteria that will kind of guide you through deciding which team did a better job of debating. But the broader answer is that you as a judge have a lot of freedom in answering that question. And that's honestly one of the beauties of this style, is that it's really up to the students to do whatever is necessary to convince you that their side is right and the other side is wrong, right? So you have a lot of discretion as to, do you find one side's arguments convincing or do you not find them convincing? And your answer to that question can be different from mine, and that's okay, right? The whole beauty of it is that if a student is debating in front of me, their job is to convince me to vote for them, right? Their job is to convince me that their side of the resolution is the right one and the opponent's is wrong. If they're debating in front of you, then their job is to convince you of that. And if they fail to convince you of that, then they've lost. And that's really all there is to it. The step-by-step process of how you end up deciding who's right and who's wrong, we'll again go into more detail about that later on. We're actually going to do a little demonstration debate for you, and we're going to have you all go through the steps of judging us and seeing, which one of us you think did a better job, and kind of walking through why one side might do better than the other or whatever. So hopefully that will clear up your answer a little bit more. But at root, we'll give you you'll have a lot of broad guidance, but it's ultimately up to you, is the short answer to that question.
Okay.
The main thing to remember when you're judging, because that is it's very nerve-wracking the first couple of times you do it. You'll be nervous. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna make a mistake. A couple of things, and we'll go over this more, as Anthony said, is one, and I tell this to all of my debaters, the judge is always correct. They're the one that signs the ballot. We are not, this is an opinion-based activity that is hopefully influenced based on information. And as Anthony pointed out, we have what's called judge adaptation, which is every round, the way you debate or the arguments you make will be different based on who's watching that round and has the ballot. So some people will focus on presentation and who has more convincing voice and inflection and talks better. Some people will not care how you talk as long as you say things, and only evaluate the way evidence is presented, or if evidence is read. And debaters will prefer what they prefer. There's no quote unquote right or wrong way to judge, as long as you're able to defend your decision and explain why you choose one team over the other.
Okay, thank you.
What other questions? These are some really, 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 really good questions. All right. Well, let's take about 10 minutes. Well, 9 minutes. We can stay pretty much right on schedule. And be back at 10:30 for Toulmin's model. So use these 9 minutes to get up, stretch, don't look at your computer or your phone, rest your eyes, get something to drink and snack on, and be ready for this next one specifically to take notes if you have not been in the lectures with me personally, because this is going to be quite a bit of possibly new information to you if you have not attended my lectures over the semester on making an argument. So make sure you have something to take notes with. And we will see you at 10:30.